Hi, so in this video I wanted to continue talking about how anti-malware vendors work, and what I'm going to do is focus on sample processing in this video. So this is kind of the second stage that we employ, sample processing, and this is something that, again, most major vendors will typically have a process like this in their back office. And this is really kind of around, again, this is the second phase of being able to translate back office intelligence into customer-facing protection. So in the last video, I talked about how samples were obtained, and before going ahead, I did want to make one clarifying remark, and I mentioned how vendors will often try to source malware from customer systems, and part of that is certainly if somebody notices something suspicious on their system, they might submit it to a vendor, but also sometimes vendors might have heuristics that can identify potentially malicious files, things that are maybe suspicious, but they're not yet conclusively malicious, and then pull those files up for deeper analysis in the back office. So that gives yet one more mechanism by which vendors can actually find interesting files. Okay, now what happens when a vendor finds a lot of interesting files? Well, first thing is they're going to have a ton of files, and in fact, typical vendors might see literally many tens of thousands of files per day, actually probably even the hundreds of thousands of interesting files per day. And these files are for the most part, at this point, are just being brought into the vendor, and the vendor really has no way of knowing off the top which ones are good and which ones are bad. Okay, and the goal of sample processing is to kind of figure that out. So one of the first things that has to happen is that these files have to be sorted in some type of a queue or some type of a priority queue, so we can figure out how to tackle them in some appropriate order. Now different ways that you could potentially sort or order these different samples include things like potential severity. So for example, does a file seem like it's coming or it could be doing something really bad without knowing much more about it? So potential severity is one thing. Another thing that might come up into play is impact, and this could be measured by, is this file, maybe it's on 10,000 systems, and if we think it's suspicious or malicious, maybe we got to go do something about it right away because it's in a lot more systems than, let's say, some other file which is on 5 systems or 1 system. Okay, customer status is a kind of a fairly important thing in terms of what actually happens. Some customers might be paying for a very fast turnaround time, so they may actually have a support contract that that involves having maybe 1 or 2 dedicated resources looking at files that are coming in, and so for those customers, you might have to go ahead and identify and analyze their files in more detail. Because these are a handful of things that vendors might use to potentially prioritize what samples they're going to look at. Now, I'm not saying any vendor actually does all these things, but these are the kinds of things you can imagine a vendor doing. Okay, now, so what's going to happen is typically these files will be prioritized and they're going to be pulled out and analyzed. And there's basically 2 ways you can analyze these files. You can analyze them using automation, and this is what I would hope is a lion's share of what happens. So automation of some sort. So for example, things like back office scanners and that sort of thing. And then the other thing that you can do is you can use manual methods. So manual methods, and this is where you might have a team of analysts. So maybe you have a bunch of analysts here. And usually these are very large teams who are all over the world. And they're basically getting these samples, and they're going to be manually analyzing some subset of those samples. Okay, and let me kind of go back here and mention that within automation, I did talk about the idea of maybe back office engines. These are things that maybe are too aggressive or not stable enough for whatever reason. They're not appropriate to put in an actual customer endpoint. Maybe they're too performance intensive, but if you have them running on dedicated hardware and analyzing lots of samples at once, you can have them in your back office to analyze samples. These are things you don't want to put on the client for whatever reason, but they're fine if you run in the back office. Okay? Now, manual methods are, again, this is something that I hope most vendors are moving away from, although I think in practice, probably more vendors are doing manual work than I think ought to be the case. And when you're dealing with manual methods, this is often around maybe dealing with specific customers who have paid for a support contract and need a fast turnaround time. They may also be looking at samples that they've analyzed in the past and trying to figure out more generic ways to detect them, or maybe they're looking for new detection capabilities by analyzing samples directly. But the reality is that most vendors I would say are probably dealing with anywhere from, in the tens of thousands to the hundreds of thousands of samples per day. So tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands, if not more, samples per day. And so with that kind of a load, you simply cannot afford to go ahead and manually analyze these samples. I mean, it would just take you too much time. The team would have to be too big, and by the time you were done, and then as mentioned in the previous video, that most threats have a very short lifetime, and so by the time you were done doing some type of a manual method, that threat might be long gone, and you'll just never see it again. Okay, and I think and aside from that, I mean, beyond just kind of looking for these types of things, they may also, during manual processing, be looking for more general trends. For example, is there anything you can notice about this particular piece of malware that you might have seen in the past? And you might say, hey, look, it looks like we have maybe a new class of malware. The last 10 samples I've seen have this kind of common characteristic. Can we do something more general to identify this particular class of samples and deal with them properly? Okay, so I'm going to actually stop this video a bit early. And the reason for that is what I'll do is in some subsequent videos, I'll talk specifically about this notion. How do we actually identify that something is malware in the first place? But really the whole idea behind sample processing is that if you have methods for identifying that something is malware, it's really around how do you prioritize those items into some type of a queue, how do you pull them off and build a workflow system around it, and then once you've analyzed it, you've got to then maybe, you've got to label the thing as malicious, so label it appropriately, and push it out for publication. So push it out for, and by publication I mean to your customers, so that your customers are going to be protected against these new threats. And I'll talk about publication in the next video. So hopefully you'll join me for that.